you can have the two operating side by side with a degree of insulation, and the violence itself is usually never more than 1 or 2% of the physical land area of the country at any given time. So if you got a
Mm.
security team with your operation who knows how to keep their ears to the ground, they can figure out what's coming and when to shut down and who not to deal with, and it can be managed. The challenge moving forward is if Jalisco really does get control of a plaza, the plazas are where the licit goods transfer through, and that's too close. El
And
Chapo and the Sinaloa use those, but they don't interfere with trade because they realize it would be bad for their business. El Mencho and the Jalisco New Generation cartel would probably have a very different operating strategy.
when you're talking about the plaza, you're talking about the Zocalo, the center of the town. You're talking about that they wouldn't operate, the cartels won't be on the fringe of
Well,
town. They'll be
specifically the trade arteries where they cross the border.
okay. So the plazas you're talking about, okay. So the access points to get into Texas or into California would be
Correct.
the choke points. What you're saying? So if they control or start to control those border points, then it's a different story.
Yeah. Right now, they're contested, and most of the violence, almost all the violence, is on the south side of the border. But if they do seize control of one and they have unrestricted access to the United States, that would threaten trade. Now, when you've got a cartel with one dude at the top who's calling all the shots, it's kind of like what's going on in China. If Xi were to die tomorrow, you would have national disintegration in a short period of time because there's no other source of authority. It's the same with Jalisco New Generation. So if El Mincho were to slip in the shower and fall on some bullets tomorrow, the forecast changed.
Fall on some just
Happens.
slip and having to be executed by an AK-47. Yeah, well, that's an unfortunate shower event. The other key theme we talked about here in Austin, but is also a key theme in your book, is the idea of the Blue Water Navy and the U.S. Navy and its importance to global trade. I had another guest on the podcast, and now I'm bringing it up, and of course I'm forgetting his name. Right, Easterbrook, his book on the Blue Water Navy in the U.S. was really important and talked about the evolution of the U.S. Navy. One of your thesis points that you're talking about in the book is that the Navy is no longer going to be the cop of the global oceans. Has anything changed since in the interim to make you think that Congress is going to appropriate enough money for the Navy to have more than 300 ships that would bolster the Navy to bring it back? What's your thinking on that lately?
No, and even if Congress did, it wouldn't matter. So if you want to patrol the ocean blue for commerce in an environment where you are not the only Navy, you're going to need about 800 destroyers. We've got 70. So the naval buildup that would be required if that's a role we want to play is simply beyond something we could do in anything less than a 50-year time frame. So I suggest you put that out of your mind. Also, at the end of the Cold War, we decided to concentrate our Navy in terms of combat power into the supercarrier battle groups, of which we now have 11. And those are great for knocking off countries, but they're horrible for patrolling because they can only be in 11 places at one time, assuming they're all deployed. So even if we wanted to, we are now technically incapable of patrolling the global oceans. That doesn't mean that we're giving up the Navy, not even remotely. Our Navy is conservatively 8 times as powerful as everyone else's combined. And the world's second and third most powerful blue water navies are Japan and the United Kingdom. So, those three countries in terms of naval cooperation get along the best of any three navies in the world. So that 8 to 1, if anything, is probably closer to 15 to 1. But that is designed for combat power. It is no longer designed for global patrol.
So when you talk about that, you're specifically talking about piracy then, and the ability of the Navy to stop piracy on the high seas, like offshore Somalia or other places like that?
Call
Is
it
that where
piracy. If a government is involved, call it state piracy or privateering. But yeah, we should expect to see a lot more of all of that.
so I had a little brain mishap there, but the book is The Blue Age: How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity by Greg Easterbrook. He puts forward a similar thesis that the importance of the U.S. Navy is hard to overstate in terms since World War II, which is a point that you make as well in your
Totally
book.
agree.
Um, but followed through on that. So is it going to be China being more active or belligerent in the South China
Nope.
Sea? What is
China
it?
might have 600 ships versus ours, but most of them are very, very small, and only 10% of them can sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. And honestly, it's not even that good because that 1,000 miles assumes that they're going in a straight line and slow to save fuel. If they're actually maneuvering like you would in war, they can maybe go 350 miles from shore. It's a coastal navy. It is not a regional, much less a global one. And the country that is most dependent upon the Americans keeping the trade lanes open is China. So if they were to do anything so stupid as to challenge the US Navy, we would just park a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, cut the energy line from the Persian Gulf, and the China would collapse as a modern state within 6 months. This would not be a hard war if it came to it.
Well, so then who's the challenge? I mean, where is this piracy? Where is this going to privateering?
Everywhere
From where will it
is the
come?
answer, because the Americans are no longer supporting the system, and so you're going to get regional powers, whether out of desperation or opportunity, looking after their own affairs in their own ways. In the case of the Persian Gulf, that means the Saudis are probably the greater threat to the Persian Gulf than the Iranians are. We're seeing what's going on in the Black Sea with the Russians right now. And what does Europe look like in a post-German system? We've seen this movie before. It is not good for commerce.
So then what's the way forward then? If I mean, because you're painting one of the macro themes of the book is that we're going to see a lot of reshoring, and this is going to be good for the U.S. And there's a point you made during your speech here in Austin that this longer term is going to accrue to the benefit of the U.S., which I think is likely true because of demographics, energy supply, geography. Geography is destiny, a point you make over and over. But then who are going to be the big rivals then if China is falling, then and Russia is weak now, who are going to be the principal rivals then for the US in terms of this next wave of growth? Is it going to be Vietnam? Who
Well,
would
the
that be?
primer on that is book number 3. That's Disunited Nations. And
Okay.
in that, I break down the countries of the future as we think of them now and explain why they're really mostly failed places and who the countries of the future are going to be. And we're going to have a series of regional powers that are capable of kind of creating a bubble of security in their own neighborhood. France in Western Europe, Argentina in South America, Japan in East Asia, and Turkey in the Levant. Of those 4, since the book came out, the Japanese have found a way to cut a series of deals with the United States, both under Trump and now under Biden. And so basically, we're seeing a fusing of the theoretical Japanese sphere of influence with the greater NAFTA system. And I think before we get too far into this, the Brits are probably going to come along for the party as well. So you'll have a kind of a super system based in the Western Hemisphere that the Americans reign over, for lack of a better phrase, that we have the 2 secondary naval powers of the world that are participating in. And then you'll have these smaller chunks that have kind of melon scooped out their own neighborhood. And the zones in between them just become no man's lands.
Well, let's talk about the UK then, because I'm looking at the UK and following, what's happening, particularly on the energy side there. They look to me, I don't want to get too technical here, but totally screwed. I mean, just totally screwed, right?
You're being very charitable.
They haven't drilled. The heyday of the North Sea is long past, 15 or more years in terms of gas production. They now import more than half of their natural gas. Their electricity prices are through the roof. We're seeing deindustrialization happening in Britain as fast or faster than anywhere else on the European continent. And yet you're pointing to, as I'm hearing you, am I hearing you correctly, that you're still bullish on Britain over the long term?
Over the long term, I mean, they have to kind of get their heads out of their asses first. So when the vote on Brexit happened, they neglected to imagine what their next step was. The Brexiteers believed a little bit of their own propaganda that they could just come to Washington